I'm Elliot Peters, and this is What Was That About?, a show that tries to get to the point of every movie. This week we're talking about a mid-century classic, the forefather of the slasher genre, and the definitive Hitchcock thriller, it's Psycho. You can expect a quick plot refresher, a couple deep dives, a tangent or two, and at the end we'll decide once and for all, what was that about? All that and more after this intro. Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm very excited to talk about Psycho today. I love Hitchcock's movies. I think Psycho is maybe his best film. It's one of my 4 favorites on Letterboxd, so that says a lot about how much I love this movie. I love it in the sense that it's a really entertaining watch, but I also love the space that it occupies in film history. It's a very, very influential movie. It embodies a lot of the things that Hitchcock really pioneered as a filmmaker. The use of the sound, the plot twists, the slasher villain before the slasher, like 20 years before the slasher genre kind of started in the first place. All of the implied violence. It really has influenced the art and also the business. Psycho literally changed the way that we watch movies. Before this film came out, it was common in movie theaters to play films over and over again on a loop. You may have heard the phrase, "This is where I came in," as a saying that people use to kind of exit a situation. Oh, well, this is where I came in, you know? And that was a phrase that came about because you would leave the movie theater when you got to the part that you came in on. So, okay, well, I've seen the whole movie now. I can leave. I can go home. But Hitchcock, when Psycho was released, he insisted that once this movie started, each showing, no one else was allowed into the auditorium, so that the experience of the plot twists would be preserved for people. It's really the first, spoiler warning type of thing that exists in Hollywood. And ultimately, as we know, if you've been to a movie theater, you know that that's how movies are shown now. And it wasn't that way before Psycho. If you buy a ticket for a showtime, the movie's going to start at that time, and then it will end, and you will leave, start to finish. No coming in the middle. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Psycho. This movie came out in 1960. It was, of course, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, master of suspense. It was written by Joseph Stefano, a screenplay adapted from the novel by Robert Bloch. Its cinematography was performed by John L. Russell. The cast contains Anthony Perkins, Vera Miles, John Gavin, and Janet Leigh. It was edited by George Tomasini, with music by Bernard Herrmann. Why did I choose this movie for the show? Psycho, as I've already stated, changed the game. Not just for cinemas, but also for Hitchcock himself. This was a major, major departure from his last picture, North by Northwest, starring Cary Grant, another thriller that I absolutely love. North by Northwest is larger than life. It's brash, it's bold, it had massive set pieces and huge, enormous stunts. Even if you haven't seen the film, you've seen a still of Cary Grant running away from an airplane, dive bombing over him in an open field. That's North by Northwest. Psycho, by contrast, was shot on a small budget. Its budget was under $1 million, I think around $800,000. It was shot in black and white with a television crew. Hitchcock actually used the crew of Alfred Hitchcock Presents to shoot the movie. This film was intimate both behind and in front of the lens. And out of that intimacy, Psycho was a very challenging movie, while also being an extremely entertaining one, which makes it perfect for this type of show. Hitchcock was the master of suspense because he knew how to direct and control audience attention, where you're supposed to look, when you're supposed to breathe, and, of course, when you're supposed to scream. Personally, Psycho is one of the largest influence on my own writing and craft. The screenplay by Stefano and the filmmaking techniques used by Hitchcock on this film in particular have seeped their way into my subconscious in ways that I'll never be able to unlearn. I'm sure that I'm borrowing a lot from Hitchcock and Psycho specifically every time that I sit down to write a screenplay. There's one particular scene that I think about nearly every time that I write that we'll get to today. On that note, what do I love about this movie? Psycho feels very modern. I first watched this movie when I was a teenager, and I had an all too familiar teenager reaction to the suggestion of watching it at first. Oh, it's a black and white movie from the 60s. I had very little experience with cinema pre-1980 at that point, and I didn't know what I was getting into. I really think that Hitchcock is single-handedly responsible for getting me interested in films from the first half of the 20th century. I attribute a lot of my interest in older films and the history of Hollywood in general to the experience of watching Hitchcock as a young teenager. Psycho is, of course, one of his later works, and films from the 60s are so fascinating to me because they exist in this liminal space just before the dissolution of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was this self-policing that the studios did from the 1930s into the 60s and 70s. I think it was around the 60s that it stopped being upheld, and it was replaced by the MPAA rating system, so PG, PG-13, that kind of thing. But the Hays Code essentially was this kind of blanket set of rules and conditions that films had to pass. You had to be certified in order to receive a wide studio release. And Hitchcock created his films are kind of horror films. They're thrillers, they're suspense. There's a lot of really dark, mature themes in the films, and the subject matter is at times unsavory. And so he got around the Hays Code in a lot of really creative ways, one of which I believe with Psycho is shooting it in black and white in the first place. You're able to show blood a lot more graphically in black and white than you would in color, because the bright red would have been deemed offensive by the Hays Code. I know in particular that infamous shower scene faced a lot of scrutiny by the Hays board, and Hitchcock had to perform a lot of very specific editing in order to get the film out there. And so the 60s films occupy that space just towards the end of the Hays Code, but not quite before the cusp of the New Hollywood movement in the 70s. And Hitchcock, as an individual, was a mainstay of the golden age of Hollywood. He came up in the studio system, moving initially from silence in Great Britain to the talkies and ultimately into color, developing mastery over all of the fledgling forms of cinema as they emerged, and really defining a lot of the language that is used by modern cinema today. And you can really see that in Psycho. In my personal opinion, no director Mount Rushmore is complete without him. And then the Herman score is incredible. The diversity of sounds that he gets out of that string section are unbelievable. Of course, the terrifying stingers during the shower scene are perhaps the most famous movie score moment of all time, but they are made all the more impactful within the film due to the beauty of the rest of the score. But what was it about? On paper, a young secretary named Marion Crane steals $40,000 and flees town, eventually stopping at the isolated Bates Motel, run by the awkward but polite Norman Bates. After Marion mysteriously disappears, her sister Lila and Marion's boyfriend Sam investigate the motel and uncover a horrifying truth about Norman and his mother. Beneath the surface, Psycho is a deeply psychological movie, full of symbolism, crowd-pleasing scares, and the extremes of human nature. It's Hitchcock's masterpiece, and in my eyes, one of the greatest films of all time. Today we're going to talk about 4 different prospective main themes for Psycho. These are motifs or themes that I see as being within the film, but we're going to talk about each one individually, and then at the end we're going to decide which of them best maps onto the film as a whole. A brief side note here. I know that this movie came out in 1960, but seeing as Psycho is the first film deserving of the spoiler warning, I do feel inclined to let you know that Psycho is best experienced if you have no idea what happens. So with that being said, I will be discussing spoilers for Psycho. If you haven't seen it, please shut this off and go watch it right now. The first theme that we're going to talk about today is that of duality. Now, when I say the word duality, of course, the first character that comes to mind is Norman Bates, who very visibly embodies a double life, both as himself, Norman, and with his kind of split personality, alter ego as his mother. But Norman, I would argue, isn't the only character that engages with this idea of duality. In fact, I think Marion Crane is in many ways a foil to Norman. And in this first scene that we're going to look at, I'll make my case for why I believe that Marion is leading a double life as well. So this first scene that we'll read takes place soon after Marion has arrived at Bates Motel. She's on the run, and Norman has taken her in, and it's slowly becoming clear that no one else is staying here. It's really just the two of them, and they're very isolated. And Norman offers Marion something to eat. Interior Norman's parlor, night. In the darkened room, lit only by the light from the office spilling in, we see Norman placing the tray on a table. Marion comes to the doorway, pauses. Norman straightens up, goes to the lamp, turns on the light. Marion is startled by the room. Even in the dimness of one lamp, the strange, extraordinary nature of the room rushes up at one. I think this is a great example of how the screenplay from Stefano paces the audience's experience of this moment. It is a room of birds, stuffed birds, all over the room, on every available surface, one even clinging to the old-fashioned fringed shade of the lamp. The birds are of many varieties, beautiful, grand, horrible, praying. Marion stares in awe and a certain fascinated horror. Close up, the various birds, two-shot, Marion and Norman. Norman says, "Please, sit down on the sofa." As Norman goes about spreading out the bread and ham and pouring the milk, we follow Marion across the room. She studies the birds as she walks, briefly examines a bookcase stacked with books on the subject of taxidermy. Close up, the books on taxidermy. Medium close shot, Marion. She notices, too, the paintings on the wall. Nudes, primarily, and many with a vaguely religious overtone. So there's the threat of these animals all around, paintings of nude figures suggesting a strange sort of sexuality, but there's a religious overtone, so sexuality and repression, perhaps. Finally, Marion reaches the sofa, sits down, looks at the spread. Marion says, "You're very kind." Norman says, "It's all for you. I'm not hungry. Please go ahead." This is like putting her in a very supplicating position. She's going to eat in front of him, and he's just going to watch her. It's very odd. Marion begins to eat, her attitude a bit tense. She takes up a small slice of ham, bites off a tiny bite, nibbles at it in the manner of one disturbed and preoccupied. This is understandable. We're in her shoes. We're experiencing the oddness of this moment, as she is. Norman gazes at her, at the tiny bite she has taken, smiles, and then laughs. "You eat like a bird." Marion says, "You'd know, of course." Norman says, "Not really. I hear that expression, that one eats like a bird, is really a falsity, because birds eat a tremendous lot." This little exchange here works primarily because neither one of them has brought up the fact that the room is full of birds yet. Obviously, we as the audience members see it. It's very much apparent, but Norman very casually or very innocently mentioning birds in conversation feels threatening. We know that he deals with dead birds, and so him likening Marion to a bird as he's put her in this awkward and a weakened position socially feels threatening. It feels scary. But then Norman goes on. He says, "Oh, I don't know anything about birds. My hobby is stuffing things, taxidermy, and I guess I'd just rather stuff birds because, well, I hate the look of beasts when they're stuffed. Foxes and chimps and all. Some people even stuff dogs and cats, but I can't. I think only birds look well stuffed because they're rather passive to begin with. Most of them." He trails off, his exuberance failing in the rushing return of his natural hesitancy and discomfort. Marion looks at him with some compassion, smiles. Marion says, "It's a strange hobby. Curious, I mean." God, this is such good writing. Each individual moment has such an impressive complexity. Norman's explanation about why he prefers to stuff birds over other animals is very interesting. It seems to almost recontextualize him as being more meek than threatening, because there's something about stuffing mammals that he can't stomach. He frames it as if it's too much for him. The birds are more delicate. They're also more feminine, and so he feels more comfortable stuffing birds. Then Marion's line in response to that explanation is to call him strange, which she then, I think, immediately regrets because she follows it up with curious, She almost tries to take her foot back out of her mouth. But Norman agrees with her. He says uncommon, too. He knows that it's odd. He knows that it's strange, but it's what interests him. Marion says, "I imagine so." And Norman says, "It's not as expensive as you'd think. Cheap, really. Needles, thread, sawdust. The chemicals are all that cost anything." He goes quiet, looks disturbed. Marion says, "A man should have a hobby. calling to mind masculinity, pointing him out as a man. Norman says, "It's more than a hobby. Sometimes. A hobby is supposed to pass the time, not fill it." Marion says, "Is your time so empty?" And Norman says, "Oh no," forcing brightness again. "I run the office, tend the cabins and grounds, do little chores for Mother, the ones she allows I might be capable of doing." Marion says, "You go out with friends?" His isolation and his attachment to his mother as being really the only other person that he's mentioned or talked about is becoming a little alarming. But Norman says, "Friends? Who needs friends? A boy's best friend is his mother. You've never had an empty moment in your whole life, have you?" Marion says, "Only my share." Of course, this all becomes a lot darker and more sinister. It reads this gallows humor once the final plot twist is made clear, and it's revealed that Norma Bates is not really alive, and Norman is spending all of his days alone with his mother's corpse. Norman asks, "Where are you going?" "I don't mean to pry." Marion gives a wistful smile. "I'm looking for a private island." Norman says, "What are you running away from?" Marion says, "Why do you ask that?" And Norman says, "No, people never run away from anything." This is why I think they're foils to one another. They embody slightly different takes on the same thematic subject matter. We'll talk about this more in a bit. But for now, Norman goes on with, "You know what I think? I think we're all in our private traps, clamped in them. And none of us can ever climb out. We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other, and for all of it, we never budge an inch." This makes sense as his worldview, right? He's very sedentary. He is stuck here, isolated, alone, going about the same routine, the same motions over and over again. It stands to reason that Norman probably would never have attracted much attention from the outside world if Marion had not come to see him and gotten involved in his terrible, awful, scary little game, which is all the more apt because Marion then says, "Sometimes we deliberately step into those traps." Norman says, "I was born in mine. I don't mind it anymore." Marion says, "You should mind it." And Norman says, "Oh, I do, but I say I don't." Duality, right? He laughs boyishly. Marion stares at him, shakes her head softly. "If anyone ever spoke to me the way she spoke to you, I don't think I could ever laugh again." She's acting out of compassion, and this seems to trigger something in Norman, who responds with controlled resentment. "Sometimes when she talks that way to me, I'd like to curse her out and leave her forever, or at least defy her, but I couldn't. She's ill." Marion says, "She sounded strong." And Norman says, "I mean, ill. She had to raise me all by herself after my dad died. I was only 5. And it must have been a strain. Oh, she didn't have to go out to work or anything. Dad left us with a little something. Anyway, a few years ago, Mother met a man. He talked her into building this motel, and well, it was just too much for her when he died too. And the way he died, oh, it's nothing to talk about when you're eating. Anyway, it was too much of a loss for my mother. She had nothing left." Obviously, this whole little explanation becomes a lot more sinister once you learn at the end of the film that Norman has killed his mother and her lover. And so none of the second half of that ever really happened. That's his rationalization of his own actions. So Norman leaves off with, "She had nothing left," and Marion responds with, "Except you." Norman says, "A son is a poor substitute for a lover." Marion says, "Why don't you go away?" Norman performs a little dialogue callback, "To a private island like you?" Marion says, "No, not like me." Norman says, "It's too late for me. And besides, who'd look after her? She'd be alone up there. The fire would go out. Damp and cold, like a grave." That's very funny. When you love someone, you don't do that to them, even if you hate them. Oh, I don't hate her. I hate what she's become. I hate the illness. Marion says, "Wouldn't it be better if you put her in someplace?" She hesitates. Norman turns slowly, looking at her with a striking coldness. She doesn't realize this, but that's almost a personal attack on Norman himself, and he responds as if it is. An institution? A madhouse? People always call a madhouse some place. Put her in some place. Marion says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it to sound uncaring." Norman's coldness turns to tight fury. What do you mean about caring? Have you ever seen one of those places? Inside? Laughing and tears and cruel eyes studying you. And my mother there? Why? Has she harmed you? She's as harmless as one of these stuffed birds. The way that Hitchcock frames these two characters in this scene is a wonderful way to escalate all of the tension that we're feeling through the dialogue and everything that's being left unsaid. Norman fills the frame, he sits forward, he leans towards Marion. Marion is framed much smaller than him, and the birds that are over her head in either of their close-ups are in striking opposition to one another. It really puts Marion in a very threatened position. Marion says, "I'm sorry. I only felt it seemed she was harming you. I meant..." Norman says, "Well? You meant well? People always mean well. They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest so very delicately that..." The fury suddenly dies, abruptly and completely, and he sinks back into his chair. There's a brief silence. Marion watches the troubled man, is almost physically pained by his anguish. She's reacting very compassionately towards everything that he's saying and everything that he's expressing to her. And Norman goes on quietly now. "I've suggested it myself. But I hate to even think such a thing. She needs me, and it isn't as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. It's just that sometimes she goes a little mad. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?" Great. Great stuff. Brilliant, brilliant writing. We've started off very strong here with my absolute favorite scene in the film. Throughout that whole interaction, you can tell as an audience member that they're both hiding something. We know what Marion is hiding. We don't know what Norman is hiding. Marion is hiding something very consciously. Norman is hiding something very unconsciously. And despite knowing less about his own situation, Norman is the one being more honest. The duality is wonderfully varied between the two of them, and we see two different examples of a way in which someone might live a double life, lying to themselves or lying to others. It's really not only Norman's psyche that is fractured. Before we move on to the second theme, I'd like to mention very quickly that I think it's very apt that right now there are a lot of very loud birds whistling and singing right outside of the room in which I'm recording. Birds are very important to Hitchcock's filmography. Obviously, his film The Birds, starring Tippi Hedren, makes wonderful use of them as a horror monster in the vein of Dracula or Frankenstein. But as you've already seen, birds are very important to Psycho as well. So it's just kind of funny that there's a very loud, very insistent bird who is trying to find a mate right outside. The second theme that we'll talk about is one that comes up a lot in discussions about Psycho, and that is the theme of voyeurism. Webster's dictionary would describe voyeurism as the practice of obtaining sexual gratification from observing others, or also the criminal act of surreptitiously viewing a person without their consent in a place where the person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. Voyeurism in conversations about cinema comes up a lot, and in conversations about the theater, because we're viewing very intimate aspects of people's lives, and we are obtaining some element of a feeling or an emotion out of that, whether that be, in some cases, sexual gratification, like in the case of pornography, or an emotional connection while identifying with a fictional character. Cinema, storytelling, theater are all very engaging experiences between the person watching and the people that are being witnessed. And most of the time, the people watching are doing so from the comfort of the movie theater or their own home. We are not being asked to participate. We are merely granted a window into these people's intimate lives, fictional or otherwise. And this film in particular, Psycho, I think is an excellent example of this, and the relationship between the audience and what you're watching. The film depicts the voyeuristic tendencies of its harrowing antagonist. Norman Bates watches Marion undress through a peephole in his office, but it also indulges in the voyeurism of cinema itself. The film addresses these politics and intricacies of watching directly in its final moments, as Norman monologues to himself in his own head. Interior, Norman's detention room, night. The walls are white and plain. There is no window. There is no furniture except the straight-back chair in which Norman sits in the center of the room. The room has a quality of nowhereness, of calm separation from the world. The police guard has placed the blanket on Norman's knees. Norman, as we come upon him, is lifting the blanket, unfolding it. His face, although without makeup and without the surrounding softness of the wig, has a certain femininity about it, a softness about the mouth and a kind of arch womanliness about the brows. Calmly, Norman places the blanket about his shoulders, as if it were a cashmere shawl. Camera remains in a position so that our view of Norman is a full one. When the shawl is in position and Norman is settled, we hear, overshot, the voice of his mother, coming from the calm of his thoughts. And it's very important that this is the only moment in the entire movie where we are granted access to the interior of Norman's head. Mother's voice says, "It's sad when a mother has to speak the words that condemn her own son. But I couldn't allow them to believe that I would commit murder. They'll put him away now, as I should have, years ago. He was always bad. And in the end, he intended to tell them I killed those girls and that man, as if I could do anything except just sit and stare like one of his stuffed birds." The intricacy of the dialogue here, treading so carefully between self-awareness and complete ignorance, is amazing. Not only does Norma Bates describe herself as if she is that corpse sitting there motionless, unable to take action, but she also references that earlier line of dialogue from the scene that we already read, where Marion insinuates that Norman should maybe put his mother away in a home, a psychiatric facility. And now Norma Bates, Norman's mother, in his own head, is saying that that's what she's going to do to him. Well, they know I can't even move a finger, and I won't. I'll just sit here and be quiet, just in case they do suspect me. A fly buzzes close, and then continues buzzing and flying about Norman's face. And here's where this theme of voyeurism becomes very, very important, because Mother's voice says, "They're probably watching me." Well, let them. Let them see what kind of a person I am. A pause as the fly lights on Norman's hand. "I'm not going to swat that fly. I hope they're watching. They'll see. They'll see. And they'll know. And they'll say, 'Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.'" Norman continues to gaze ahead into nothing. It's the final vignette of the movie. Norman is completely alone, and yet he thinks, "They're probably watching me." And who is Norman alone with? He's alone with us, the audience. We're watching him. And Anthony Perkins is staring directly into the camera lens. It's such a scary, uncanny, fourth wall breakdown that Hitchcock performs in the final moments of Psycho. The antagonist of the movie is aware of us. He's looking at us. He's talking about us. I've never seen any other film attempt, much less pull off, something quite like this. The word watch appears 18 times in the screenplay for Psycho. Sometimes in the action lines, sometimes in the dialogue, always in terms of the verb to watch, just in case anyone was wondering if any of those 18 were referring to a timepiece. But the most curious use of the word is here, in the final struggle between Sam and Norman, who has come in attempting to kill Lila dressed as Norma Bates. In a series of cuts, we see the fight. Norman and Sam struggling, the wild fury in Norman's face, the mad noise of his screams and vile curses, the terrified fight-to-the-death look of Sam, the still, staring Lila. A close on Mrs. Bates, her face. She appears to be watching and enjoying the fight. Over the shot, the sounds of the struggle, the screams of Norman. That shot, that cut to Mrs. Bates, is a cut directly to the face of the corpse. The withered husk of that old woman watching the fight. Throughout the movie, the characters watch each other. We watch the characters, and death watches us all. The third theme that I'm going to talk about is guilt. Marion Crane suffers from extreme guilt over her crime, while Norman is incapable of feeling any guilt due to his fractured psyche. The word guilt appears 6 times in the screenplay of Psycho, and it's attributed only to 2 characters throughout. I'll read one of the scenes in which it appears right now. This is in the opening minutes of the film, as Marion has procured a new car with which to make her getaway. She's fleeing with her money, and she's trying to find her private island. She has just recently had a tense encounter with a car dealer and a police patrolman. Marion is driving tensely. Camera is close on Marion's face now, recording her anxiety, her fears, her guilt. There it is, shines bright in her eyes, and she is a person unaccustomed to containing this much guilt in this realistic situation. Suddenly, we hear the sound of the used car dealer's laugh. We hear it as clearly as Marion hears in her imagination. The car dealer's voice says, "Heck, officer, that was the first time I ever saw the customer high-pressure the salesman. Somebody chasing her?" The policeman's voice says, "I better have a look at those papers, Charlie." The car dealer's voice says, "She looked like a wrong one to you?" The patrolman's voice says, "Acted like one." Marion blinks, shakes her head, as if trying to shake away these voices of her imagination. She checks the rearview mirror. Still no sight of the patrolman. She tries to force herself to relax, almost succeeds, when she's sprung to tension again by the sight of a police car. As she drives past, we hear the squeaky, unintelligible voice coming over the car radio. Marion zooms down on the gas, whizzes ahead, dissolved to Highway 99 long shot, Marion's car dashing along, and then another dissolve to Marion much later. She looks weary, tired with strain and with hard driving. Her eyes are heavy with worry and deep thought. Marion has a couple more imagined encounters with these voices in her head on her way to Bates Motel. In this scene, the subjective perspective of Marion Crane, and specifically the emotion of guilt, is brought to life through the intercutting of an imagined conversation with the reality, objective reality of the images. This scene really reminds me of Hitchcock's first sound picture, which was called Blackmail. In that film, around the midpoint of the movie, a woman murders a man in self-defense. And from there, the camera and the filmmaking display her state of mind through experimental and creative blends of images and sounds. The film as a whole is not necessarily worth watching unless you're a Hitchcock superfan, but that one sequence is really what does make it worth it, because it can be seen as a precursor to something like this. The experience of bringing to life the subjective and imagined perspective of a character under extreme duress through image and sound. I want to talk about Marion very briefly, because she is one of this film's most interesting inventions, in that she appears at first glance to be the protagonist of the movie and then is abruptly killed off towards the end of the film's kind of first act. From that point, the movie almost treats her sister, Lila, as the true protagonist of the movie. A lot of people do describe her as being that. In fact, the Wikipedia article for Psycho describes Lila as the true protagonist, but I would disagree. I think Norman Bates is the protagonist of Psycho. Much of the action revolves around him, the film seems to be named after him, and for all intents and purposes, he's the character that we spend the most time with and are the most interested in unpacking. Just because Lila and Sam end up being the heroes of the story and Norman is sort of a villain, doesn't necessarily stop Norman from being the protagonist of Psycho. That being said, Marion and Norman, as I've already discussed, are best described as foils of one another. And it's interesting that as Marion is consumed on this drive by feelings of guilt, Norman is incapable of feeling that specific emotion for his actions. He doesn't fully understand that they're even his actions to begin with. So guilt is a very important and interesting emotion in the world of Psycho because of the way that it's engaged with by the different characters. The fourth and final theme that I'm going to talk about is one that I briefly touched on earlier, and that is the theme of repression. Throughout the film, the motivation for wrongdoing is explored through weaponized suspense. That is weaponized against the audience, really. Marion steals $40,000 towards the beginning of the movie. Sam eventually accuses Norman of murdering her for the sake of the $40,000, as if to steal from her. But Norman never learns about the $40,000. Norman's motivations are much more obfuscated than simple theft. They're obfuscated from the audience, but also from Norman himself. We don't know why Norman kills, and neither does Norman. In fact, Norman doesn't even necessarily know that he kills. Additionally, The heavily gendered symbolism of Psycho evokes repressed psychosexuality. Although this is never directly explicated for us, it is much more implied and left up to us to explicate, even in moments where it's directly addressed. In order to talk about it, we're going to look at the one scene in which it is directly addressed. Interior office of the Chief of Police, full shot. This is just before Norman's final monologue in his detention cell. He has been caught, the final confrontation has played out, and a young man with a serious frowning face has just come into the room. He is Dr. Simon, the psychiatrist. He goes to the desk where the box of coffee containers has been placed, takes up a container. The district attorney says, "Did he talk to you?" Simon says, "No. I got the whole story, but not from Norman. I got it from his mother." Everyone gazes at him, mystified. He speaks as he removes a lid from the coffee container. Simon says, "Norman Bates no longer exists. He only half existed to begin with. Now, the other half has taken over. Probably for all time." Lila asks, "Did he kill my sister?" Simon says yes. And no. The district attorney cuts in, "Look, if you're trying to lay a lot of psychiatric groundwork for some sort of plea this fellow would like to cop," but Simon goes, "A psychiatrist doesn't lay the groundwork. He merely tries to explain it." Lila says, "But my sister is," and Simon cuts her off. "Yes, I'm sorry. Have you any unsolved missing persons cases on your books?" The chief of police says, "Yes, 2. Simon asks, "Young girls?" The chief of police nods, astounded. "Did he confess?" Simon interrupts, "As I said, the mother. To understand it, as I understood it, hearing from the mother, that is, from the mother half of Norman's mind, you have to go back 10 years. To the time when Norman murdered his mother and her lover. He was already dangerously disturbed. Had been ever since his father died. His mother was a clinging, demanding woman. And for years the two of them lived as if there was no one else in the world. Then she met a man, and it seemed to Norman she threw him over for this man. That pushed him over the thin line, and he killed them both. Matricide is probably the most unbearable crime of all, and most unbearable to the son who committed. So he had to erase the crime, at least in his own mind. He stole her corpse, and a weighted coffin was buried. He hid the body in the fruit cellar, even treated it to keep it as well as it would keep, and that still wasn't enough. She was there, but she was a corpse. So he began to think and speak for her. He gave her half his life, so to speak. At times he could be both personalities, carry on conversations. At other times, the mother half took over completely. He was never all Norman, but he was often only mother. And because he was so pathologically jealous of her, he assumed she was as jealous of him. Therefore, if he felt a strong attraction to any other woman, the mother side of him would go wild. When Norman met your sister, he was touched by her and aroused by her. He wanted her, and this set off his jealous mother, and mother killed the girl. After the murder, Norman returned as if from a deep sleep, and like a dutiful son, covered up all traces of the crime he was convinced his mother had committed. Sam says, "Why was he dressed like that?" The district attorney says he's a transvestite. But Simon corrects him, "Not exactly. A man who dresses in woman's clothing in order to achieve a sexual change or satisfaction is a transvestite. But in Norman's case, he was simply doing everything possible to keep alive the illusion of his mother being alive. And whenever reality came too close, when danger or desire threatened that illusion, he'd dress up, even to a cheap wig he bought. And he'd walk about the house, sit in her chair, speak in her voice. He tried to be his mother, and now he is." We have now read both my favorite scene and my least favorite scene from Psycho. Many people, myself included, would prefer a cut of the film that discards this scene altogether, preferring the experience of organically interpreting Norman's actions without the film's intervention. It's really not just me, ask Roger Ebert. But the scene does allow us to talk more in depth about the specific approach to repression that the film takes. And it's a careful one. By playing coy about the gender dynamics of Norman Bates, and despite being 30 years older, Psycho avoids falling into the same dated trap as a film like, say, Silence of the Lambs, which attempts something similar with its antagonist, Buffalo Bill, but sticks to a dated and regressive, harmful stereotype about transsexuality that ultimately disservices the film as time goes on. Psycho plays in the same line of fire, but comes out unscathed by allowing the unknown to continue to remain unknown, and therefore the repressed to continue to remain repressed. In other words, Norman isn't a violent trans woman, which I think is what they're going for with Silence of the Lambs, perhaps one of the more dated and offensive aspects of that movie. I do enjoy Silence of the Lambs, but that is the part of it that has aged the poorest. Additionally, Norman's fascination with his own sex and the sex of his mother is cut from a more Oedipal cloth. This makes it deeply uncomfortable, and these two characters, one of whom is dead the entire duration of the movie, have a very intricate and interesting relationship that has been much more further explored in the Bates Motel series. I say further explored, but they extrapolate a lot from Robert Bloch's novel and from the film, inventing a lot more of their relationship and their history in order to try to explain how a relationship like that might have come about in the first place. With all that being said, what was it about? Let's go through the themes here. We have duality, embodied by multiple characters. Voyeurism, embodied by multiple characters and us, the audience. Guilt, interpreted by different characters, one of whom is consumed by guilt and one of whom cannot feel it at all. And repression, which is the main driving force of the narrative from a plot perspective. One of these stands out more to me as being what Hitchcock is trying to do through the camera, through the lens, than all the others. And so if you were to ask me, what is Psycho about? I would say voyeurism and the experience of watching a movie. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to give the show a rating and a review wherever you're listening. And if you think you know somebody who might like the pod, share it around. You can watch video versions of the podcast, as well as find clips from the film that I've talked about today on my social media and YouTube pages. Just visit www.whatwastthataboutpodcast.com. There you'll find my weekly blog, Under the Paperweight, and you can follow me wherever you like. Instagram, Letterboxd, you name it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.